Adrian, why do we really need an IMF agreement? Explain that to the average person. Because there are persons out there who believe that, oh, we don't need the IMF at this time. We can go it alone. Can we?
We can't. That's a simple answer. And the IMF is really, let's call it the international lender of last resort. You go to the IMF when your domestic sources or your organic sources of foreign revenues have dried up or isn't sufficient to meet your normal bill paying exercise. So that's what the IMF is there for. In the case of Jamaica, if you look at our net international reserve, it has been declining steadily since the start of the year. And if it continues on this pace, then by December 2012, I would say, we will have a serious problem to address. And that's why you need the IMF, because if the country has insufficient reserves to pay for its imports, then there is a serious problem. And that's why the average man on the road should know that Jamaica at this stage needs an IMF agreement going forward. Importantly, what the IMF does, the IMF lends into a program, right, a financial program, and it lends into a program that it believes is sustainable. Now, that sustainability or that stamp that the program is sustainable gives other creditors confidence that they'll be able to recoup whatever monies are loaned to Jamaica. So in the instance of the other multilaterals, let's say the IDB, the Caribbean Development Bank, or European partners and so on, they will be waiting for the IMF to agree with Jamaica that what is on the table is sustainable, and that in fact if they lend Jamaica more than what they have done in the past, then they will regain or recoup those loans. So it's very, very important for people to understand that the IMF is there as an entity that encourages governments to behave in a fiscally prudent way, to ensure that the economy is such that balance of payment problems are solved or largely solved. And in the instance case of Jamaica, as I mentioned before, given what is happening with our reserves, then we definitely need an IMF agreement. And critically, the IMF agreement, as you mentioned before, opens the door for budgetary support from the multilateral partners. If you look at Jamaica's finances, that kind of support is something that we need.
What would happen if we decide that, okay, we're going to renege on this debt?
The issue with Jamaica's debt is that it is largely owned by locals. In other words, the persons who buy Jamaica's debt are largely Jamaicans. They are Jamaican institutions, they are average savers, mom and pop kind of investors. So in other words, savings are tied up in government paper. So if the government were to default, it's not like it's defaulting on some foreign entity or some foreign investor. It's defaulting on Jamaicans, which creates a significant problem. And we saw what happened with FinTech. Now, you'll be actually setting off a nuclear bomb if you were to default on those obligations, because it means you would have abrogated or taken away savings from one section of the economy to another, which is central government, thus placing the private consumer, the private investor, in a very, very serious situation, which could actually create a bigger problem than what we have right now.
What do we have to do to bring about this well-needed IMF agreement, and how critical is it for us to do it?
Well, the first thing that IMF wants to see is that your financial program is sustainable. Your fiscal trajectory is sustainable. For Jamaica, that means that we have to get a compensation formula in the public sector in terms of how we reward public sector workers. The public sector wages to GDP must be at most 9% by 2015-2016. So that will require some tough action by the government to achieve that. pension reform, that's another thing that the government has to do to ensure that public sectors can retire with dignity and be confident that they will have a pension check coming to them. So that's very important. Divestment of public assets, the government has to do that to ensure that the public purse will not have that contingent liability for failing companies. And also the government has to implement tax reforms to ensure that we have a tax system that is constructive and conducive to economic growth, that you don't spend an entire day trying to pay the government, or businesses don't find themselves with a dilapidated environment and therefore reduces productivity. And so those are some of the things that the government has to do to ensure that the IMF is interested.
How critical is political will to really effect the kind of momentous change that an IMF agreement calls for at this juncture? Obviously, if the government were to do all of what you're saying, it's tantamount to political suicide. These are unpopular things, but they have to be done. Do you think a consensus could help?
A consensus will definitely help. The problem is that with our competitive politics, you're likely to get that consensus. But you know what I think? Leadership is about doing what's right. And what's right in this instance is to ensure that the reforms are implemented. Sometimes a good leader will have to take short-term setbacks as far as popularity, even in terms of political office. But history will be kind to that leader. And in this instance, we need leadership that is brave and that is thinking about the long-term interests of the country.
Thanks. Dr. Stokes, thank you very much.